Well, good evening and welcome to this two-part webinar. We're so glad you are here. This is a webinar designed for public school teachers, administrators, and other personnel. Hello, I'm Victoria Cobb, President of the Family Foundation, and I am so excited to bring you what I hope will be some valuable information that will hopefully help you navigate some very challenging times in public schools. The Family Foundation has had a long history of advocating for parental choice when it comes to education. When family life education, more commonly referred to as sex education, began to incorporate very sensitive and values-laden topics, we worked really hard to ensure that parents had the right to remove their children from those lessons. 2 years ago, we helped champion legislation that gives parents better access to family life curriculum by making that content available online. But today, our public schools are facing an entirely new set of challenges as it relates to equity and social justice through dangerous teachings like critical race theory, social emotional learning, and of course, transgenderism. In tonight's webinar, we're going to tackle critical race theory and how it's infiltrating K-12 education. It's a topic that has stirred the emotions of people and has led to an outcry among parents. All across the country, we've actually watched as people have just been so outspoken, parents at school board meetings just simply demanding school officials reject CRT and its core tenets. Specifically, Loudoun County, Virginia, as many of you know, has been at the epicenter of this debate, not just over CRT, but also over the model transgender policies that we'll talk about next week in this webinar. But there's still some uncertainty among public school teachers and other professionals over what critical race theory is. What is this theory about? Where did it originate? How is it creeping into the schools? And most specifically to the folks who are joining us here tonight, how should good teachers that disagree with this philosophically respond? So tonight, we'll seek to answer some of these questions and more with an expert. And if you are a public school teacher, please be sure to stay until the very end to learn about some other important resources that you can access. Now, before we meet our guests, I want to remind you that in order to avoid distractions, the attendees, you guys are muted tonight throughout the entire webinar. But if you have a question, you just submit it through the chat feature, and our webinar administrator will help facilitate a Q&A. So with that said, I'm excited to just get straight to our guest. And our guest tonight is Jonathan Butcher from the Heritage Foundation. Let me give you a little background on Jonathan. Mr. Jonathan Butcher is the Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. And in that role, he has researched and testified on education policy around the United States. He's currently actually writing a book for Post Hill Press discussing critical race theory in schools and America's national identity. In 2021, earlier this year, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster nominated Jonathan to serve on the board of South Carolina's Public Charter School District, a statewide charter school authorizer. Other interesting things to note is that he's been involved in editing chapters of the book, The Not So Great Society, which provides conservative solutions to the problems created by the ever-expanding federal footprint in preschool, K-12, and higher ed. A whole bunch of other things I could say about Jonathan. Prior to this role, he was also the education director at Goldwater Institute, where he remains a senior fellow. And I think of interest is that you have been able to see him other times. Maybe you've watched him on C-SPAN, Fox News, even HBO's Vice News Tonight, and many other guest radio programs. Or maybe you've read him. His commentaries have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Education Week, National Review, Newsweek, Forbes, all sorts of places. And so we're excited to have him tonight because I think he's going to add a lot of dimension to this topic. And for some of you, it may be a good baseline. For some of you, it's going to be that extra step of, okay, I got the basics. Now what do I do about it? So we're thrilled to have him. He holds a BA in English from Furman University and an MA in economics from the University of Arkansas. So welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
We are thrilled to have you, and I'm trying to kind of get us diving in, because I think there's just so much to unpack here. And I think we want to start with critical race theory and really unpacking what it is as a philosophy. And there's a lot to talk about here, but can you just start with, for folks, a basic definition that we can work from for the rest of tonight? What is critical race theory?
So critical race theory is a worldview. It's a philosophy that believes that everything in public and private life must be considered with respect to your racial identity. So it is meant to be something that affects your decisions. It's meant to be something that drives the choices that you make each day. It originated from a philosophy that dates back to the 1920s and 30s. But before I give you the roots of that, let me just say quickly, it is at once a philosophy, right? It is at once a perspective on how we consider the things that happen around us. It is also meant to be applied. It is meant to be something that changes what you do, that drives your actions. Specifically, and I think many of the teachers that are on this webinar may be familiar with this idea that more and more today, the curriculum that is catching parents' attention and that parents are concerned about is material that asks students to do certain things, such as protest at the Capitol or put together different presentations that have a political bent to them. And that is very much in line with what the original critical theorists wanted, right? It is meant to be a set of ideas that you apply in an effort to change what the originators of critical theory thought as a world divided between the oppressors and the oppressed. So I gave you a little bit more than a short answer there, but we can start at least by saying that it is nothing less than a worldview. It is meant to shape the decisions that people make.
That's actually what I was going to ask you. You know, this I've heard it described as a lens through which we look at history, we look at modern things around us, and really, to me, that sounds like a worldview. So I was actually going to, sort of say, so is it fair to call it a worldview? But I guess you think that is accurate.
Well, I absolutely do. And part of it is because of where it originated from, right? So in the 1920s, you had a group of German Marxists who were very frustrated that the working class in Germany had not successfully staged a revolution in the same way that the Bolsheviks had in Russia. And the writers, the historians on critical race theory, people like Martin Jay, and more recently, there was a book called The Grand Hotel Abyss, that sketched the origins of critical theory, and they explain this, right? I mean, you had Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse. Eventually, it all started with a gentleman named Felix Weil, who was a independently wealthy fellow who called together a first Marxist work week in the 1920s and gathered a group together to consider the future of Marxism. So this group of academics were all, nearly all, Jewish. So when the Nazis came to power, even though these men were established at the University of Frankfurt, which is why their school is often called the Frankfurt School, they were chased out of Germany in the 1930s, settled in America at Columbia University in 1937. And from there, they influenced a host of particularly law professors and law students. And these law professors and law students took the two foundational ideas from critical theory, which were Marxism, right? This economic struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. And they combined it with a Freudian postmodernism, right? Where there is no authentic truth. There are no facts on which we base our decisions. Everything depends on our experience. And every situation, everything that we would call a fact, depends on the circumstances in which it happens. So, if unpack this a little bit, I mean, this certainly denies the existence of a God, for one, right? It denies the existence of what we would consider, values such as ultimate freedom, of truth, certainly. And so when you pair these two things together, that is how you wind up with those in law schools in the United States saying, okay, the world's divided between the oppressors and the oppressed. I can see that in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And so that makes American law systemically oppressive. the critical race theorists who came in the 1980s, late 1970s, 1980s. So Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris, eventually Gloria Ladson-Billings, they would all say, okay, the critical legal theorists need another step, right? We need to explain why it's oppressive, and it's oppressive because of race, right? Everything is a function of race. So every system of oppression is a function of that. So that gives you sort of the academic lineage, right, of critical race theory. And I think as we talk a little bit more, we'll start to see Marx sneak his hand up here a couple of times too. So I can point that out when we see that.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable that folks hear this, because I think there have been conversations about its connection to Marxism, and yet those that would support it sort of deny that a little bit and say that sounds like crazy talk. But you'd say there's a pretty straight lineage to get from one to the other, and they build upon each other, basically.
So, when you give talks like this, right? So you can, if you lead with the idea of Marxism, immediately some in the audience may just tune out, right? And they may just say, all right, so look, this is just somebody else who's, got sort of an axe to grind, and so they're going to call everything Marxist. So let me quote for you a couple of things, okay? So start with Ibram Kendi, who says that capitalism and racism are conjoined twins, which sounds remarkably Marxist, right? Maybe to be a little more direct, you can take, and I think I have the quote right here, otherwise I can summarize it because I summarize this all the time, but yeah, I won't be able to pull it up. So Angela Harris, a critical race theorist, said in an essay that she wrote for Columbia that Marx's dazzling analysis of capitalism and how the proletariat will overthrow the ruling class will happen as certainly as the sun rises, or something like that, is still riveting today to contemporary theorists. So she's a critical race theorist making directly that link to Marxism.
There's sort of a reclassification of the oppressors by a skin color, regardless of the fact that there might be examples of that skin color in the working class, and there might be examples of non-white skin color in the proletariat, but that's not the point. That's kind of what this is doing.
Well, sure. And I think once you scratch away the top here of this discussion about race and ethnic identities, you get pretty quickly to where is this all trying to go? Like, yes. What's the ultimate aim, right? And we can have a discussion about history without using critical race theory. Certainly, people did that for years. So why is it needed? Like, why would we need to look at the world through a critical lens? And that is because once you get to the bottom of it, there is a very intentional approach to create equal outcomes according to the powers of a system, right? So what I mean is that it's not just about providing equal opportunities anymore. That's not enough. And that's why critical race theorists object to the Civil Rights Act, right? They are highly skeptical of the Civil Rights Act and say that it is, frankly, I think Derek Bell once called it something like a paper tiger was the phrase that he used. And that's because the critical race theorists believe that government should engineer equal outcomes. And Ibram Kendi in particular is very clear about this in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that's what he believes government should be doing. And those who have been listening to the Biden administration so far this year have seen, both in policies as well as in some of the remarks that they have made, that they are trying to engineer equal outcomes. And anyone who tries to do that from government can only do it through coercion. There's no way that a ruling system can create equal outcomes for anyone without lifting some people up while pressing others down.
So that's obviously one of the harmful objectives of this, is to basically say we're shooting for outcome equality, not equality of opportunity. Are there any other objectives that we should be concerned about? The media, government, they're all trying to downplay this thing. Anything else sort of as a main objective that we should be just kind of ears open to?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of applications, right? So what does it mean if the world's divided between the oppressors and the oppressed? Well, that would mean that America's founding principles are a lie, and that the American dream doesn't really belong to everyone. It only belongs to those that have money and a certain skin color, right? That's what a racial divide means. And so that's why we see lessons, for example, Iowa City Public Schools has the lesson from Teaching for Tolerance on their website about white privilege, right? And going all through how there is white privilege, and those based on the color of their skin are able to control and have access to certain benefits that people from different skin colors will not have. And regardless of anybody's behavior, they're guilty of being a part of that oppressed class, right? That's the concept of white privilege. Your behavior doesn't matter. It's the tribe that you're in. So, I think this is what's happening right now in the media and in government and in academia, is as more people learn about what critical race theory is, we're having this discussion right now, teasing out what does it actually mean when we apply these different ideas? Because I can tell you what Derek Bell wanted. So Derek Bell, the godfather of critical race theory, he said that he hoped that the academic resistance would lead to wide-scale resistance. That's what they're after. They're after a destabilizing effect on our existing social and governmental and public structures. I mean, they said as much.
So this is obviously something that great harm could occur should it be swallowed wholesale by our society. But let's take it now to the classroom, right? So those who are pushing this very hard, you said it should be applied. This is intended to be applied. So they are pushing very hard to say that it's not really impacting these schools. So what I think as teachers and administrators, what's important for us to understand now is like, how is that being done? So maybe if you could help us start with maybe just what are some key terms that we should be, when we hear those terms, it should signal like, so I tell people all the time, don't be looking for the words critical race theory, right? Because in Charlottesville, Virginia, they call it courageous conversations. Doesn't that sound so great? They're just changing names. So, help us think through what are terms that should tip us off that we might be heading down this road in the curriculum or in the way that we're asked to apply.
Okay, so if I may, there are 3 myths that I'm going to walk through that I think will help answer this question. So the first myth that we hear a lot in the media today is that critical race theory is not being taught in schools. And so to refute that, I'll point to a couple of things. So for one, the Portland public school system has a critical race theory working group who holds meetings and posts their meetings on YouTube. And you can see it. It says Portland Public Schools, critical race theory. It's right there. In Hayward Public School District in California, the school board just a few months ago released a memo, it's public, it's on their website, that says that they will use the words critical race theory as they teach California's Ethnic Studies program. Speaking of California's Ethnic Studies program, the California Ethnic Studies program, which was created by the California Department of Education, has an entire chapter on intersectionality. Intersectionality is one of the core principles in critical race theory, and it was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in an essay in the late 1980s. And intersectionality it's sort of a natural extension of this idea of oppressors and the oppressed. With intersectionality, what Crenshaw and what critical race theorists say is that every person is a member of at least one tribe based on ethnicity, gender, or some other immutable characteristic, or perhaps even chosen characteristic. And because society is oppressive, any perceived oppression then gets layered on top of each other, and it becomes an intersection of all the oppression that you face. So, if you are of a minority ethnicity, if you are female, if you are homosexual, and so you can just take any of the perceived slights, even microaggressions, that is what they call them, that you see, and you just layer them on top of each other. So anyway, point being that it's there by name in California's Ethnic Studies program. You mentioned Loudoun County. They, as many people on this call may know, if you followed what's going on in Loudoun County, the school district contracted with a company that did professional development for teachers using the words critical race theory. Okay, so the myth was critical race theory is not taught in schools. I just gave you 4 examples of critical race theory in schools around the country. All right, the second is critical race theory is necessary for an authentic retelling of history. To this one, I'll ask, why then was Gloria Ladson-Billings, professor, University of Wisconsin, longtime critical theorist, teaching teachers, one of the most widely cited critical race theorists in colleges of ed today, she was the keynote speaker for the National Council of the Teachers of Mathematics annual conference in 2019. So do that again. A National Association of Math Teachers had Gloria Ladson-Billings, a critical race theorist, as their keynote speaker. Just earlier this year, there was a National Association of Science Teachers that once again had a critical race theorist as their key speaker, talking about something about critical affinity spaces in the sciences, right? So no, it's not just about history. And that's why I described critical race theory before as a worldview, because oftentimes you'll have in the media, they will say, hey, look, critical race theory is just something that's used to develop tolerance and help us understand an authentic understanding of history, right? And that's not what's going on here, right? This is a view of a redefinition of words like equity and equality and social justice, right? These have all been taken captive by these ideas based in this very, very Marxist concept of reimagining what truth is. Okay, third myth has to do with my last comment there about compassion. So there are some who claim that we need critical race theory to teach us what it means to be compassionate. And to that, I would respond by reading some 2 quotes here. One from Paulo Freire, whose book Pedagogy of the Oppressed is widely used in colleges of ed today. There have been studies done in the recent years saying that Freire's book Pedagogy of the Oppressed is still widely cited. Freire said this. He said, more and more, the oppressors are using science and technology as unquestionably powerful instruments for their purpose, the maintenance of the oppressive order through manipulation and oppression. Does not sound compassionate to me. That was his perspective, right? Okay, the second one I'll read is from Frantz Fanon. He was the founder of this concept of decolonization. It's another term that you may hear being used that is straight out of the critical theory lexicon. With decolonization, the idea is that you need to remove any works from white individuals and anything that is referring to the Western canon, okay? So Fanon says this, he says, use all means to turn the scale, including, of course, that of violence. He also said, national liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people, commonwealth, whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon.
Wow. This is some, so I heard in there, you know, we got to pay attention to intersectionality, equity, social justice. When we hear those terms, we're going to have to be, you know, ready to kind of know what's behind them, what's being unpacked. And I, maybe you didn't say it so directly, but I heard you say when one of our governor candidates, former Governor Terry McAuliffe, says this is all fear tactics, fear mongering, that it's not really happening. Maybe he's a little off base in our Commonwealth.
I mean, there's evidence to show that it's happening in Virginia, it's happening in Iowa, Texas, California. I mean, we have examples in Massachusetts. I mean, we have examples from all over the country. One that might be a little more common that some on this webinar may have seen is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. So diversity on its own, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, that is something that, you know, we should encourage and welcome, right? But when you attach diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of critical race theory, what they are talking about is the removal of rights from some people and the elevation of someone else's rights. And that comes straight from Herbert Marcuse, from his essays from the 1960s. He wrote one that was, of course, in a very Orwellian sense, titled Tolerance. And it's all about how we should no longer be tolerant of a ruling class, or what they call white individuals in the United States, that they actually should have their rights, such as speech, removed.
Right.
And those rights should be given only to what he pointed to as, those who had been marginalized. And look, in fairness, and I have worked for conservative institutions my whole life, okay? We can say and should say, no matter which side of the aisle that we're on, Americans in the past failed to live up to the promise of opportunity and freedom, right? Slavery was systemically racist, period, okay? The Jim Crow era was a stain on America's past, but not everyone, even at that time, was racist, right? The historian Sean Wilentz, he's a writer from Princeton and professor, he has a terrific book called No Property in Man, where he says the truth is that the abolitionist political movement originated in the United States. England may have abolished slavery before we did. France did at one point too, but then went back to it. But nevertheless, when Benjamin Franklin and Quakers in Pennsylvania began creating abolitionist groups, this was the first time that organized politics resisted the idea of slavery, which had existed for millennia. So we can say today, right, that America was not built on white supremacy, right? It was not our creed, it was not our principles that were at fault here. It was the application of them. It was those who were carrying them out, which means then that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Movement were seminal moments in our history because at that time, government no longer sanctioned racial discrimination, okay? Culturally, the Civil Rights Movement made it okay for us to say that racism and racial prejudice and discrimination don't belong here, right? And that's the legacy that we carry now, right? And that's the legacy that we carry forward.
And yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate what you said about things like, just this idea that there is real harm that comes in when this stuff creeps into the curriculum. You were sort of, the underlying theme, I worry a little bit about children of any other ethnicity, any other race besides white, thinking that there's no hope, that somehow, because it feels like it's a permanent, they sort of teach it as this is the permanent state of mankind, is that, there's always this, they've always been the oppressor. All systems are systemically problematic. There's this hopelessness I get concerned about. Any
Certainly.
other major consequences?
Well, yeah, I was going to just interject just very quickly. I've mentioned Derek Bell's name already here. In his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, the subtitle of that book is The Permanence of Racism. So the critical race theory belief is that it's always here and we can never get rid of it. Ergo, there will always be struggle and there will always be a reason to be a revolutionary, to be an activist, no less. So you talked about what are the negative consequences. Well, I mean, I think that's a big one, is what you're talking about with this concept of the American dream and what it means for human flourishing. The research is clear that when you consider family formation, so the idea of whether a child is from an intact family or not, when you take into account a child's background, many of the distinctions between outcomes of children from different races begin to disappear, right? Not entirely, but there is significant research showing that it is not a racial question so much as it is a question of family formation and background. That goes a long way to explaining the different rates of behavior that we see. There's happy to point to references. Ian Rowe, who's an expert at the American Enterprise Institute, has done excellent research on this, as well as Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia has done this as well. One of their findings was that 91% of Black millennials between the ages of 24 and 39, if they finish high school, get a job, and get married before they have children, will stay out of poverty and reach the middle class or above, right? That's a pretty significant thing when you have people like Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times saying that there is nothing that can be done, right? That there is simply a system that must be reshaped around the history of slavery, and that is the only way we can define the future for ourselves. So those are some pretty strong competing ideas there.
Yeah, and the idea that it's one thing we want to say teach great Black history, make sure those voices are part of what's taught and but sort of critical race theory is this idea of we're gonna elevate the moral stature of someone's opinion through history, their perspective of history because of their skin color, and make sure we minimize sort of the white voice to the point of there's a greater and less than, not a two different perspectives around something, which is a challenge. And I think we have to look through our curriculum and really be thinking that through. Are we telling all the stories, but are we telling them sort of with equal weight and validity that people see things differently, are a part of history in a different way? So all of these pieces play into what our teachers should be really looking out for when it comes to critical race theory. And I appreciate that you hit on the rights issue. I think that's really important, that we think of our nation as sort of built on these fundamental rights, the right to free speech. But critical race theory really believes that rights should be secondary to outcomes, which is a little bit scary if you actually take it to its, and so teaching kids that, equal rights are actually not really what we're after. We're after sort of equal outcomes. And if we need to harm someone's right to speak or to be, whatever it might be, association or whatever, in order to achieve the outcome, that's a worthy cause in some way in the minds of a critical race theory.
And you described it exactly well. And Ibram Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist says it in this quote now that is used all the time, where he said that the only cure or the only solution for present discrimination is future discrimination, right? That's it to a T, right? So everything that you just said, that it is okay to trample rights in order to somehow level the scales from the perspective of the government. A quick note here about curriculum. A great example that I can give you of the differing sides here. So 1776 Unites is an organization that Ian Rowe is a part of, Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center, Glenn Lowry from Brown University writes these, John McWhorter, anyone following this issue may be familiar with those names. They've created a curriculum that does talk about individuals who were Black and were successful in American history. They emphasize the ideas of human agency, of lifting yourself up by hard work, by dedication, all of the things that Booker T. Washington was writing about 120 years ago, right? On the flip side, you have Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, where he wrote a book about American history from the perspective of Native Americans, of what he said were Blacks in the US, all saying that, no, this wasn't the creation of the first system that would be truly representative and allow for a beautiful combination of liberty and responsibility. Instead, this was an oppressive system meant to keep certain people down, right? These are the two competing things that you have here. And happy to say more about Howard Zinn's book, which has quite a bit of plagiarism in it from what historians say, and a number of other problems. Not to mention no footnotes, which I think should hurt the heart of any historian or history teacher.
Yeah, and I'll make one more comment, and I know we have to move on to a couple other things besides just critical race theory that's happening in our public schools along this same line. But I will say, of course, we're catching on to the Southern Poverty Law Center curriculum that's sort of entering, and in Charlottesville in particular, we saw exactly what you're talking about, where kids are asked, was our founders, were they putting in a system of freedom, and I forget how it's said, or were they putting in just to get slavery, basically, as if it's a black and white, yes, no, as if there's no gray, as if there's no, as if everybody was unified in their purpose. And just teaching kids to look at the history that way is a very simplistic and unfortunately incorrect understanding, and it's sort of framing it in a terrible light. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I do want to get to something else, which is in Virginia, the Department of Education has actually developed some guidelines for teaching social emotional learning. Now, this is a little bit of a different topic, but actually what concerns me a little bit is there can be some gelling between these two things. But so some suggest social emotional learning promotes positive values for building self-esteem. Would you say that's what it's about, or what should teachers really know about this particular thing?
I mean, the title is just like diversity, right? It's not something that we would think, gosh, that sounds like an awful idea. It doesn't. It sounds like something that is wholesome, right? But I have seen in socio-emotional curricula the ideas of white privilege, these same kinds of condemnations of people based on their ethnicities that we've seen in other curriculums. So I think just like math, science, as well as English literature, and of course history, critical race theory is it has injected itself into this concept of socio-emotional learning. I don't know that all socio-emotional learning is necessarily bad. I think what's happened though is that in order for schools to try to teach what parents want, which is issues of character and values, we did a nationally representative survey last year, and we asked parents the question, do you want character taught in schools? And more than 80% said yes. So I think that schools, in some sense, maybe subconsciously to be responsive to this and seeing this, what parents may want, created this thing called socio-emotional learning to replace what we would call religion or faith or values, right? Otherwise. And so I think that is, that's what's been done here. It is clearly very, certainly secular. It has no religious components to it. And so I think, yes, I mean, it is as vulnerable to this very damaging perspective as any of the hard sciences, as well as literature.
Yeah. From my perspective, when I think about, so I sort of look at some of the objectives or the things that are taught, such as, one of the, a teacher term would be, some of the, what's the learning point here? I can recognize and describe unfairness and injustice in many forms, including attitudes, speeches, behaviors, policies, practices, and laws, right? So if you couple critical race theory with, I'm teaching that as a value, we have kind of a real messy situation. Very similarly, I can recognize conscious and unconscious bias. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really gets me, is this idea that that unconscious bias is something that we should be teaching children to look for. It obviously is in line with this idea that everything around us is oppressing us, right? So there's, again, you're replacing this idea of pursuing individual agency and human flourishing with, let's find all the ways that we're oppressed and protest that. Let's base our life around this idea that there's horrible things happening that people are doing that they don't even know. So your behavior doesn't matter. All that matters is what you unconsciously are doing, usually based on the color of your skin. Yeah. It makes your head sort of lift off your shoulders and spin around in a circle.
Well, and our counselor friends can relate to this. When people are in conflict, a lot of times one of the key elements is assuming positive intent. Try to walk into the situation with someone else and assume good, because you might get to a better outcome, right? But what are we teaching our kids? Assume there's unconscious bias. So it's almost like, maybe it's unconscious, but we're going to assume the worst is happening and going on. And, and then there's an item about recognizing that certain people have privileges. Well, sure, but do we really need to teach that? And then which people, if we're teaching critical race theory, which people are we going to teach that actually have these advantages and disadvantages? So we're basically that's the value, and we're going to add in skin color as the defining lens. So you can see how these two things can really gel together. So let's get to teacher impact. So teachers in Virginia are going to have to participate in cultural competency training in order to be fully licensed. So we've literally attached the license to this idea to teach in public schools. So are you aware of what this is, what kind of training this is, and what teachers can anticipate in this next thing that we've now done here in the Commonwealth?
I've seen some of the reports from the Virginia Department of Education on this. They are similar to what's been done in Illinois. Illinois has done something very similar, where they rearranged, or they changed, frankly, the teacher certification standards and inserted what are, ultimately critical concepts, such as there is no right and wrong. Everything depends on your perspective. It brings up all of these different concepts of finding unconscious bias, recognizing your own unconscious bias. I think that's one of the things that teachers, if they haven't been asked already, it's a common component of diversity trainings where teachers are asked to, okay, so think about your skin color and how you grew up, and list all the ways that you may have some sort of bias based on what you do, right? You have to examine, assuming that you are biased, right? assume that you're wrong, and let's list all the ways that you're wrong. And this is one of the applications of critical race theory that is very, very close, if not already violating the Civil Rights Act, right? These applications where perhaps some of the most visible ones are affinity groups that are done by force. So it's one thing to have a voluntary affinity group where you say, hey, look, we're going to have, corporations do this all the time, right? You'll have individuals of certain ethnicities, they'll create an affinity group, they'll meet and talk. Okay, voluntarily, that's fine. But if you are forcing students to be separated according to skin color for different school projects, such as has happened in Illinois, there's a lawsuit in Illinois on this right now. There's evidence of this in New York City public schools as well. That's something different. So what I'm leading to here to answer your question about what teachers should be looking for is looking for these ways in which you are being compelled to profess or adhere to or believe any idea that violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964, including one race is superior to another, individuals deserve certain benefits or sanctions based on the color of their skin, et cetera, right? These compelled ideas that are a part of diversity trainings are highly problematic and certainly may be ripe for a lawsuit to make the case that critical race theory is in fact a racially discriminatory and thereby illegal practice.
Yeah, it's interesting, your mention of these affinity groups, and for some reason it reminded me of one of the things that we've had going on here in Virginia, which is a battle over a specialty school that we have in Northern Virginia, which, when you get to this idea of equality of outcomes versus equality of actual opportunity, we have a specialty school for math and science, whereby it happens to be majority Asian, actually. That is the largest population group. And we're basically, the legislature literally considered changing everything because it didn't have enough other minorities that they wanted to see as drivers in that school. So even though everybody's the same opportunity, right, we're going to take specialty, we're going to look at skin color and we're going to try to create some scenario by which it's equal outcome there. And so yes, there's cultural competency and there's sort of going through these certifications, but be looking for these places where we say, we're not just trying to learn and understand cultures. We're not just trying to be sensitive to cultures. We're actually trying to change the outcomes for something in particular.
I've actually seen, sorry, I just want to mention very quickly, I've actually seen school board statements that have been passed in just the past few years that say they are committed to equal outcomes for all students.
Yes.
And look, we should all be committed to success for all kids. I'm not saying we shouldn't be committed to that.
Yep.
But if the board is committed just to equal outcomes, the implications of that are profound and quite frightening.
And we saw that there was a large discussion about removing advanced math until junior year, simply because we didn't have enough of certain races in the math. So long story short, it was like, we have to, unfortunately, instead of moving up, helping kids with tutoring and whatever it takes to get them into, we're going to take it out, move the standard down, dumb it down. So that's what people should be looking for, are those things they start seeing. I want to make sure we get to the big question for teachers is, how is all this stuff going to impact their job? And even more than that, because I know I want to get to some questions people are asking besides just sort of what we know they're going to be asking. So what's the implication? And then maybe what's some practical things teachers can do to thwart this kind of indoctrination? What should they be doing besides being heads up? Okay, so then it's coming at them, suggestions.
Well, I mean, I think the best thing that I can offer is to stay true to the idea that racial discrimination has no place in schools or culture or anywhere else. And so I think that if there is pressure from administration to implicate or to for you to apply racially discriminatory concepts, that I think that it's a responsibility for all of us, teachers, parents, policymakers, to say no. I mean, to say that that's simply not appropriate for us. And I would say in the polling that we have done and that I've seen from Parents Defending Education, the group Parents Defending Education, from the Council of Trustees and Alumni, that when asked the question, do you think America's history and our present should be defined based on slavery and racism, or should it be defined on America's promise of hope and opportunity? More than 70%, close to 80% of parents say yes, that it should be defined by those ideas, which means that there is support out there among parents who are saying, no, what's happening here with critical race theory in schools and these discriminatory ideas, I don't agree with it and I don't want it happening. And for anyone who's watched on YouTube all of these different speeches that parents have been making at school board meetings and on and on, I think there is very much I think a general just a core, a deeply held value, right, among parents, that they know that discrimination is wrong, and I think that making them aware of what's going on, like you said, is important, and being willing to stand up and say that it just can't be a part of will not be a part of my classroom.
I'm going to try to hit these questions. We got a fair amount of questions, so I'll do what I can here. How does CRT square with federal and state laws that prohibit discrimination based on protected classes, right? So we're saying, don't discriminate, but yet we're actually like judging things by skin color. And it says, particularly in government-run, taxpayer-funded schools, can these laws be used in any way to try to get at this?
Yes, a great question. And the lawsuits are happening now. The two that are at the top of my mind, one is happening in Nevada, where you have a child in a charter school, has his family, they filed a lawsuit saying that the school was going to require him to either sign something or write something admitting white privilege as a graduation requirement. So he filed a lawsuit saying, that violated, discrimination, anti-discrimination provisions. The second one is this one I mentioned earlier in Illinois, where you have a teacher in Evanston saying that there were affinity groups used for teachers. They were forced into affinity groups for certain training programs. So that's another lawsuit that's ongoing right now. And ultimately, that's what this is going to come to. I mean, I think that you can have policymakers make laws all day long, and policymakers have done enacted a number of provisions over the past year, but until someone presses the issue and takes it to court and asks the court to rule that yes, these ideas such as affinity groups violate, decisions such as Brown v. Board of Education, not to mention titles probably 4 and 6 of the Civil Rights Act. That I think is what's next on the horizon.
All right. Somebody asked a good question about what do you think about the ADL's No Place for Hate campaign making inroads in schools? Are you aware of that? And maybe tell people what ADL, anyway.
Yeah, so I know a little bit about it. I have been a part of a very small research project that looked at the No Place for Hate campaign. To me, given the ideas and concepts in it, it is not as advertised, right? It says no place for hate, but it is actually one of these very, it sort of takes language and flips it upside down. It's sort of like, I tell you what it reminds me of. In New York City, the teachers union up there, the United Federation of Teachers, I think, they adopted the Black Lives Matter Week of Action principles. And one of the principles is something to the effect of, we're going to accept everyone, no matter what kind of thing. They have this, that's one of the principle. Following that, they have a principle that says they want to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family. So you can't have those two things exist at the same time. So the same thing with this no place for hate thing, right? Where you're saying that, and my memory is going to fail on what some of the specific ideas were in their they had a booklet I know that I saw, but I remember it being many of these same ideas where they say, yes, we don't want anyone to be bullied, but you must accept, people who say are trying to enforce their position on, say, gender identity or something like that. So it's one thing to tell people, not to bully someone else because they're homosexual. It's another thing to say that you have no choice but to agree with them or to accommodate them and their choice of XYZ activity in school, right? Based on, you can think of any number of things from, locker room policies to, different groups that meet after school and who can go and who can't and that kind of thing. So short answer is yes, I think No Place for Hate is another one of these very Orwellian projects where the title means the opposite of what's really going on.
Yeah, we've had a lot of, let's call something the opposite of what's actually the word that we've always known it to be, or the definition we've always known a word to have. Karen Huff on our question and answer asks, so she's got a training tomorrow she'd like to avoid, but so her question is, do you know legally if she refused to participate this based on the fact that it's a worldview that they can't compel her to accept? Is there, would she be the first person to do that? And is there already litigation in that direction you know of by any chance that's literally saying, look, you got a worldview and you're forcing it me to swallow it because it's more than just, facts that I'm teaching kids?
The two lawsuits that I'm most familiar with are the two that I gave you already. I don't know anyone who has sued on compelled speech grounds. I will say this, though, the model bill that the Heritage Foundation has posted on our website that I wrote with my colleagues was based on this idea that no public institution can compel a teacher or student to believe, profess, adhere to any idea that violates the Civil Rights Act. So the Supreme Court has already made rulings on compelled speech saying that no, right, you cannot be compelled to believe anything. The difficulty, I think, when it comes to public schools and public school teachers, that there are also rulings saying that in the course of your public duties, a public institution can restrict speech in the course of their professional duties. So I wish I could say, and again, I'm not an attorney, I'm sort of giving you my read on the law based on the attorneys that I've worked with at Heritage, but it is not entirely clear what that would mean. I can't advise really on what to do about that. My suggestion is to take copious notes and then provide that material, which should be public anyway, if you're a public teacher at a public school, provide that material and expose it. Give it to a investigative journalist and give it to me, or I'm happy to connect you with someone at the Daily Signal who would be glad to make that public knowledge. Sunlight is a great disinfectant.
Yeah, I think that's a big to-do, is sort of make people aware of what the curriculum is that you have. There's lots of, you can do that publicly, or you can just simply slip it to a lot of interested people in the conservative movement that can do something with it. Family Foundation, Jonathan, others. The other thing that we had pondered, because we've kind of gone down this road before, which is that there are a lot of Christians who happen to be creation-oriented people who have been taught to teach evolution. And the way that they have typically handled it is to say, this is a theory, and really emphasize the theory component. So one of the things that, I have suggested to folks is that when you trip over this stuff and you're expected to teach it, you're really clear. This is not as the world is, this is as the world, as some believe it to be. What do you think about that as an approach?
I agree, and I think that makes great sense. And I think especially with critical race theory, I do think that's a great approach, because I would say that it's not a school's job, public or private, to protect anyone from ideas with which they disagree, right? I don't think it's and I don't think it's the job of a policymaker to limit the ideas that are discussed in a classroom. Now, that's different than an application. That's different than asking someone to either write a paper sort of affirming or supporting, certain concepts, or be a part of a project that says this is the right way for everyone to believe about American history, right? Those sorts of applications, just like affinity groups, I would consider that compelled behavior. So, we should teach children at the appropriate age who Marx was, right? At the appropriate stage, right, in life. The same thing with the 1619 Project, critical race theory. Explain to students, again, age appropriate, what these things are, because if they don't get it from a teacher who is aware that there are highly different, perspectives as well as very harmful outcomes, they're going to get it from the media, or they're going to get it somewhere else, and then they will only have that to fall back on.
Absolutely. Now, we did have a question, so I'll just real quick answer this. We did have a question on, can we repeat the concept of sort of what an affinity group is? An example of an affinity group. So I'm the president of a nonprofit. If I met with a bunch of other presidents of nonprofits instead of like CEOs of for-profit businesses, that would be my affinity group. But a lot of times those are done on race, right? So we're going to have an Asian affinity group or an African-American affinity group. And his point was, it's fine if that's voluntary, but if the classroom literally is being taught sort of like, okay, whites are over here, blacks are over here, and Asians are over here, and Hispanics, and and the teacher is almost compelling affinity groups rather than you voluntarily choosing to be a part of connecting to people that might have similarities. You're really being categorized. I guess that's sort of my simple explanation. So that somebody was looking for a little clarification. Well, at this point, what we're going to do, I'm going to let Jonathan have the last word on this part, and then we've got one other speaker I can't wait to get to for just a few minutes as we head towards the end here. So Jonathan, anything we didn't say, you want to re-emphasize, kind of the takeaway for teachers, or last word here on this in your part?
Well, my hope is that what we will see in the very near future is lawmakers taking this idea that teachers should not be compelled to profess certain beliefs. And I think that that is the best way, along with partnering these ideas with the Civil Rights Act and explaining the importance of that, are a great way to make a legislative proposal withstand a lawsuit. Because with the NEA being as aggressive as they have been on this issue, especially over the past 9 months, especially this summer, where they committed to making sure it was taught in every classroom, I think this is going to be played out in court. And so whatever proposals deal with this, they're going to have to be sound.
Awesome. Fantastic. I'm going to ask Tracy Bailey to pop on his video at this point. I'm going to introduce to you teachers a resource we want to really equip. So our point isn't just to sort of talk. We really want to equip you to be the best and do the best. And we've had a fantastic time with Jonathan. Thank you for being a part of this. And I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit into the equipping, which is to introduce Tracy Bailey, who is the State Director of Virginia Professional Educators. VPE is the largest non-union, nonpartisan teacher association in Virginia with over 6,000 teacher members statewide. Now, this isn't in his bio. He doesn't say it this way, but I will say, and he doesn't have to endorse this, if you don't like what we're talking about, you need to make sure that you are not a part of an association that is putting into office people who are passing these policies. And that is why the Family Foundation really supports groups that are non-union opportunities for teachers to get insurance and other things that are needed, because unfortunately the unions have been very specific in what they've done politically, and that has landed us where we are in this moment talking about this. So that's why we're excited to have him here. But just to give you a tiny bit of background on him, Mr. Bailey spent most of his teaching career in Florida, teaching AP Biology and Physics, AP Physics and Chemistry. And in 1992, he was honored as the State Teacher of the Year for Florida. Then in 1993, he was named Teacher of the Year for an entire United States. So those of you that have had it for your county here in Virginia or been the Virginia Teacher of the Year, that's a big honor. And then to be the United States, pretty big deal. So Mr. Bailey's also served in the Florida Department of Education before moving to Virginia to lead the Virginia Professional Educators. On a personal note, and this is always the most important part of my bio, so I'm glad that you included it, he has 9 children, and he is the grandfather. I don't have that part in my bio yet, but grandfather of 5. So he and his family live in Fredericksburg. Tracy, tell us about your organization and why it's valuable for these teachers, especially in this moment.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that introduction, and I'll be brief here at the end. I think Jonathan did a great job covering a lot of these current issues, and I just want to say we're getting phone calls and questions from teachers about, what can I say, what can I do, can I be forced? I'm just concerned about the situation it puts me in, and I made some notes as Jonathan was talking. I said, many of these policy issues, these brand new things coming along, they can be confusing and problematic, and it's difficult enough being an educator on a good day, but these issues can be so problematic because they put a teacher right in the middle of somebody else's controversial idea, somebody else's approach to implementing a socio-political agenda. And again, teachers are paid by the state, paid by the school system. I don't have time to go into the details, but yes, you do have to do a lot of things that you're told. I mean, they can tell you certain things just like any other employer. You can't wear that, you can't do this, you can't share your own personal views too freely. Your free speech rights are a little bit limited when you are an employee, but that doesn't mean that you have to start espousing things that do go against, particularly as Jonathan points out, civil rights issues. We'll more on that in other conversations. I think the main thing that both the Family Foundation and the Virginia Professional Educators would like to get across is You don't have to be a part of the VEA, or in some counties, they have an AFT affiliate, the other teacher union. You don't have to be a part of those kinds of organizations to get the help and the legal protection, the liability coverage that every teacher needs. That's the reason that VPE and other independent teacher associations were started, that we focus on the classroom, we focus on helping teachers with all of those issues, usually to a greater degree than the teachers unions do. That's all we do, is help teachers in the classroom with those issues. And it could be something as simple as a parent complaint, or a disagreement with an administrator, or a child gets hurt on the playground, or questions like we've covered tonight. We offer $2 million in legal and liability, which is twice what the unions do, because we focus on what teachers want, not on candidates and elections. And we don't make contributions to candidates or political parties. We don't get involved in hard dollar or soft dollar donations the way teachers unions do. We don't allow our staff, even if they're supporting a good candidate in their personal life, we don't let them do that on company time. That's not the role of an association. They can go work for somebody and do that, but not like some organizations where they have an army of union activists to go out and work politically. I'll mention a few last things. I know we need to wrap up tonight. You know, the teachers that are calling with questions about these issues, I want to state on their behalf and on our behalf that these are teachers that care about diversity. These are teachers that care about treating all students and colleagues equal under the law. These are teachers that are trying to do the right thing, but they're being thrust in a situation where they're now worried about either offending somebody unnecessarily by lumping them in groups, or implementing some of these approaches that are very blunt. Some of the comments our teachers have said is that what they've seen of the CRT approach in their particular areas is that it seems to be more divisive and accusatory than it is unifying and supportive. That it seems to be more about labeling and categorizing people by race and skin color, rather than giving each person their own worth and viewing them as unique individuals with unique experiences and a diverse range of personal beliefs and values. Again, these teachers are trying to build a camaraderie and a classroom environment of teamwork and support and respect, and this, they feel that this is undermining that to some approach. So anyway, I'd like to open it to talk at some point to any teacher who is interested in joining or being a member of us. Since money does matter with fiscal conservative families, we provide a lot more help for about 1/3 the cost of the teacher union dues, and none of that money goes to support things that would violate your personal beliefs or your political preferences. So Victoria, I appreciate the job that the Family Foundation has done in organizing this webinar and Jonathan's great input. And we just look forward to helping teachers work their way through these complicated issues. Thank you very much.
We are so glad that you are here to kind of make that pitch, because I mean, a lot of times I get asked, you know, why isn't Virginia further along on some conservative concepts? And sometimes the answer is because there's a teachers union that is pushing back against some things that some of us would really love to see happen. And so some teachers just want to stay out of that political fight. And it's awesome that you are there to provide that. I want to move to just mentioning some resources in our last little bit here that the Family Foundation has to offer relative to this. If you go on our website, we've got under Speak Up, which is sort of our how we equip people. Under that section of our website, there's actually conversation tips, which is us trying to dumb down critical race theory into easy ways to talk about it with other people. We also have a great video where we interviewed just an excellent resource on this topic. It gives you about 20 minutes just to kind of watch and listen to another person dig deep on this issue. We've done a 2-minute thing. So there's a fair amount that we can offer if you want more, or you want shorter or more, a different format. We've done some radio show. We do a weekly radio show, and we've done at least one full episode, if not more than one, on critical race theory in particular. So there's a lot of resources on our website. And then I can't help but mention that we have a law center, Founding Freedoms Law Center. Certainly, we actually yesterday were just discussing this whole idea of, if critical race theory is truly a worldview, is there truly a deity component? Is it a faith? And are they actually teaching and it's a long story how you get there, but there's a legal route there, and we may end up having to, you know, be a part of that. So if you find yourself in a situation as we actually know there's already been a teacher fired over another issue in Virginia that we are part of that, helping out in that. And we just know that that's going to arise. We hope it's not with our audience here, but if it is, know that you can call us. We would be, Founding Freedoms Law Center, be happy to try to help you in that situation. We feel very strongly that you have to answer to your faith and your conscience before you answer to anybody else. And we just hope that that can continue to thrive. We've always found that very compatible in our public systems in many ways, but it's a struggle right now. So we're here to help. The very last thing I'll say is you don't want to miss next week's webinar. We're gonna, same time, same place, does this count as a place, be back on Zoom at 7 o'clock next Thursday. We're going to talk in detail about Virginia Department of Education's model transgender policies. What do those mean in your classroom? What does that mean for your school district? And we would be just thrilled to have you back. Invite your friends. There's still plenty of room for folks that they can jump on in. And again, this has also been recorded, so we can make that available if someone needs this for another purpose. But thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you to Jonathan. Thank you to Tracy. Fantastic opportunity for us to chat together on this. And we hope you guys just absolutely have a great evening and hope that you have found this time with us valuable. Thanks again. Have a great night.